It was 2006 when my wife and I saw a Bigfoot in New Brunswick, and I was 62 at the time, and I never really gave Bigfoot a thought. It just wasn't on my radar, but I just gradually started studying it. There's literally thousands of books about Bigfoot. It's really amazing. I've read 106 books, and so that's given me a little head start on many people. But I will say that, the books you read, it's our opinion. Sometimes it's more hard fact. In fact, Dan has got, it's 25 years he's had a publication, and he's going to have a catalog, Bigfoot Times. I think this is the 10th year we've had a conference. Is that about right, Shirley? Yeah. It's been interesting. I've always enjoyed all the company or people have their stories, and it's been great. These posters back here are mine. Certainly feel free to take pictures of them. I started out doing Bigfoot research. It was sort of before PowerPoint come out, and that was the way I went to conferences and had posters. But I'm really amazed how many times people take pictures of my posters, because that's my interpretation of what I've learned. My experience is best to find them in the fall. I like the bird hunt. The birds are pretty safe when I'm out there, but at least I try. But that is a good time of year to find stuff. Always carry a good camera, and if you think they're in the area, take a look. A lot of people have cell phones today, but I actually prefer a camera that you can document. I figured I got 18 power zoom on that thing. This is in Kentucky. Some people, analysis thought it was a coy dog. I call it a mad ape.
Man, that's Squatch.
See, nobody, usually on those hikes, we tell each other where everybody's at.
They've announced it, wouldn't they? Yeah, sure. We don't usually do that many together. No. And that sounds like the real McCoy, doesn't it?
I had my recorder sitting on my camp chair. The other guys came back and were amazed too. But then they wanted to go down and see him, and I said, "You go ahead, I'll watch the fire."
What is it?
I think that's Charlie coming back.
Listen. You hear that? Yeah, maybe.
Listen to that background howl. That's really
All of
something
those
I
things. What does sound like? I think it's left. I think it's some Bigfoot. I guess I recorded it.
These things are like pissed off.
Yeah.
It's like people back here. That's not nice. Because you're breaking up a call. No, that's not a person. That's.
Yeah, it's coming from that way. That was a woman. Yeah, but was that a woman? Yeah, just exactly like that. What, that way too? Yeah, like it's started over here. Like that. Oh, I want to wait that. Yeah, get behind me. That's impressive. You just shared with all of them? Let's go. Let's go. Come on. Let's go.
Whoever wants to. Let's go and see. I don't know, we should all go.
Yeah.
That's a fire, right? Yeah, you guys.
I guess you can see what I'm made of. If there's an ape down there, you go get him. I'm going to pass.
What would you say was the one moment that really had you sold on it, if you will? The one moment where you were like, I'm all in, I 100% believe.
I don't think I could identify one moment, but I could identify with the PG film, which I was fascinated by, the Patterson-Gimlin film. Not just watching it many times, but after Renee DeHinden died in 2001, there was a lot more study on the film by Bill Munns and some other people and some other studies, that actually freelancers that have posted stuff up on YouTube that are making these points about the subject in the film. And it just, all the information I'm seeing, it made me completely sold on the idea that the PG film is 100% real. And if the PG film is real, then Bigfoot is out there by process of deduction. So it wasn't just one thing, because, I mean, if I were out in the woods and saw a very good trackway, I would be sold on it, but that's never happened.
Yeah.
The trackway I've seen were degraded by rain and possibly a couple of days, so they weren't the best tracks, but they were tracks. But I think if I saw tracks, really good tracks, I would have been 100% sold, or a close-up sighting 100% sold. But I've never seen one, so I don't know. I don't know in the sense that, well, I'm confident they're out there, but it's just like, I would like to see one. I haven't, but, you know, seeing one would be, again, it would reinforce your idea that you already have.
Does everyone know about that film, right? Patterson-Gimlin Film. We've all seen it on TV. We've all seen it on YouTube. For short, I just call it the PG film. And so the title of my presentation is It's Not Rocket Science. And when you have that in your lunchtime conversation or whatever, that means that it's so easy, it's ridiculous. So first of all, there's a fellow by the name of Todd Prescott, a Bigfooter from Canada. Has anyone heard of him? He puts up on YouTube a lot of old videos that have kind of been lost to time, but now they're up again. And some of them are with Roger Patterson, the guy who got the famous film. And so he's being interviewed on camera. And I always say to people, forget about the secondary witness or the person, the secondhand report. Always try to go to the source. Roger Patterson was the source. And he said that the subject, that when they measured the tracks after they got the film, that the step lengths were 43 inches. And so this, you could go on YouTube and find it. Find that the actual words of Roger Patterson, 43 inches. I thought it was more like 40 inches or so, but 43 inches. Roger stated in his newsletter, extremely rare newsletter before he passed on, he died in the early 70s of Hodgkin's disease, and he was only, I'm 5'7", he was 5'3", so he was about right here. He stated that what he saw was about 7'4" tall. Bob Gimlin, who was with him, said that he felt that it was much shorter than that. But you have to remember, most of the time Bob Gimlin was on his horse. So when you're up high, you may have a different perspective of how tall or how small what you're looking at. And you've all seen the film, and you could watch it again, and you say like, well, wow, the subject in the film seems to be unnaturally, if I'm walking like this, you know that I'm exaggerating my gait, my step. Everything else prior to the PG film and after the PG film, in a way, most of everything that we've collected are stories, eyewitnesses that have had experiences. And I, for one, believe all of them, or most of them. And it's just like, you know, you have a credible witness, why shouldn't you believe him? He said he saw a Bigfoot cross the road and he was driving and it was 4 a.m. in the morning. And so if the same guy told me, he says, you know what, I saw a deer cross the road at 4 a.m. in the morning on my way to work, I would never have any reason to challenge him. And if he said he saw a Bigfoot cross the road, I said, well, he's the same guy that saw the deer. Why wouldn't I believe him when it came to the Bigfoot? Because a lot of us think that those things don't exist. So mostly everything prior to 1967 and after 1967 is what we would call anecdotal evidence, is that someone has an oral confession as to what happened. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that they don't have evidence that something happened outside of their word. With the PG film, we have many things in place. We have, number one, a film of the subject. Number two, we have a film of the footprints that were photographed with film on a second reel of film after the subject film. Number three, we have 2 eyewitnesses. Number 4, we know the exact location of the film. And so with that, I'm going to get off track for a little bit. On many of the YouTube videos you see today of Bigfoot, quotes around that, you don't know the name of the person who took the video. You don't know the location. All you're asked to, quote unquote, believe is the subject that you see on the screen that might be fuzzy or whatever. So, as I stated in my newsletter, if you don't know the name of the person, you don't know the location, just keep moving on. But here, in October 20th of 1967, everything was in place. We immediately found out who the photographer was, Roger Patterson, because after the film, he called a newspaper. I mean, if you're hoaxing something, you're not going to call the newspaper, you're not going to give away the location, and you're not going to film in broad daylight. That would be the worst thing you could do. And you're not going to call up to Canada and tell, as Roger Patterson did, and ask to see if you could get tracking dogs down there. Because everything he did is exactly what you don't want to do if it were a hoax. If it were a hoax, you would not want to tell people where it was, because then they could go to the film site and do their own work and find out what was what. So, and what else is there? So after the incident, so I've mentioned several things that are in place with the film that make it more than anecdotal. There's physical evidence left behind. They took photos of the tracks that the subject left. And so after the fact, within that month, later in the month, a Bigfoot investigator from Canada, Bob Titmus, who was in Canada at the time, and Roger and Bob went up to present their film late October, and Bob was in that audience, and Bob Titmus spoke with Bob Gimlin and spoke with Roger Patterson, and Roger told Bob where the location was. But Bob had been down in that country looking for Bigfoot in the Bluff Creek area prior to that. So he already had some working knowledge as to where that location was. So he flies down from Canada, which is really, I mean, the gravity of the matter was such when he saw the film, Bob Titmus, he probably felt to himself, I need to get down there ASAP. So he flew down there and started looking for any evidence of Bigfoot. And Roger Patterson told him there were tracks left behind. And on his first full day up there, he went past the tracks and didn't find anything. It was on the second day that he found the tracks. And he made 10 or 11, possibly 12 plaster of castings. And then when I said we were going to get down to granular on this a little bit, I didn't find out till much later, when John Green and Jeff Meldrum and myself were in Willow Creek in 2000 for the grand opening of the Bigfoot Museum, Willow Creek, California, John Green casually mentioned, by then Bob Titmus has passed on, casually mentioned that he took one of the plaster castings and gave it to a lady friend. So what exists now at the Willow Creek Museum is about 10 original castings, but there may have been more. There may have been 1 or 2 more that, according to John, one was given an original casting to a lady friend, and no one knows who that lady friend is, and that plaster casting is probably gone. So Bob is there right after the incident in October. The film is shot in October. Bob Titmus is there late October, finding the physical evidence in the sandbar and making plaster of Paris castings. So let me back up a moment, back to the granular. There was another guy in the Bluff Creek area at the time, a timber management assistant by the name of Lyle Laverty, and he had a 35 millimeter camera with him, and he had a logging crew because they were assessing what trees were going to be trimmed in that area. And so he went out on that weekend. The film was shot Friday, October 20th. So Lyle Laverty is camped in the area in Louse Camp, which is south of the film site. He never said that he saw Roger or Bob riding around on their horses once. But it's a big area, and there's a good possibility that you would never see one another because the area is so big. And so he went out that weekend because I asked him in a telephone interview, I said, well, how did you find out about the film? He says, I don't remember because it was so long ago, but I must have found out through the newspaper, because the very next day, October 21st, Saturday, the story of, it was called Mrs. Bigfoot is Filmed, was in the Eureka Times-Standard. And so that's how Lyle Laverty found out about the film. And so he was curious enough to know on Monday, October 23rd, to get into that area and to look for that film site because he was curious to know what may have happened. And he came upon the tracks, and he took photos of the tracks. Ken showed you a photo, but possibly I have a photo of what Lyle Laverty shot. And he was 170 pounds at the time. And so I asked him that question because if anyone's going to ask questions, it's going to be Daniel Perez. And so I asked him, I said, Lyle, how heavy were you at the time? And he says, I think it was about 170 pounds. And so then I asked him, I said, well, how deep were your tracks in your boots sinking compared to the subject's track way? And he says, I hardly left a dent compared to what was seen. And even today, he's still living in Colorado. He's still skeptical of Bigfoot, but he says that this is what I saw, and he says if they fake those tracks, I can't figure out how they put so much pressure to make the depth of the tracks, because the tracks sunk almost an inch deep in that sandbar. And so in order to do that, it's either a super elaborate hoax with a lot of money behind it, or it is what Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin claim. They came upon a Bigfoot, they got their camera, Roger got his camera out of his saddlebag and started shooting.
Do you feel as if going out looking or hunting for Bigfoot is possibly destroying Bigfoot's habitat and maybe could prevent the race from, or the being itself, or the species from growing?
I just don't, certainly we've had quite a bit of urbanization, and it does take away from habitat. But it is surprising. Gabe is going to talk here another hour, and he's found a surprising amount of habitat evidence of Bigfoot in the metro areas. Many of these big cities have swamps that are ideal Bigfoot habitat. And there's a lot of people really hate it when they drive through the state land. Here's these clear cuts, which there's no question it's ugly. Yeah. But the DNR does that to regenerate the growth, because deer, birds, Bigfoot, everything survives on young growth. My wife and I actually live in a pine forest where there's 80-foot pine trees, and the undergrowth is minimal. There's nothing, deer wander through in the spring when they're really hungry and eat it, but there's really no good forage there. It's good for the tree-dwelling birds and like that, or squirrels that eat pine cones, which many of them do. But, and I'm not so sure Bigfoot doesn't either. But clear cuts, they're ugly, but you usually, if it's in decent ground, in 5 years, you can't see through it. You can't do bird hunting, it's too thick. And you look at the new growth, you know, be 10 foot tall and you can't see, and you got all kinds of new growth, and that's what Bigfoot eats.
Yeah.
They're herbivores. I mean, they eat everything. They eat animals too, but the herbivore feature of it, you couldn't find a better place for a Bigfoot. I often think I'm going to do more hiking and cut over areas that, you know, but I never get around. Usually when I get around to it, it's too hot and you can't really bird hunt it. And some of these really in good soils, you could have a whole family of Bigfoot laying out there, you wouldn't even know it. Nobody goes through it. No people go through it because you can't bird hunt. And it's really, in many cases, it gets so thick, it's very difficult to walk in.
When we were there in 2012 doing research on the film site is still there. Many of the stumps are still there. Many of the trees are still there. This stump is still in existence, which is this stump right here. And I've also taken a close-up photo. You can't see it too well, but see this slash right here? That slash is right there, but it's hard to see. You remember I discussed the piece of wood that René de Hinden retrieved? Right there. And he originally took it home as a souvenir. That was his first thought, to take it home as a souvenir. This is what they call frame 352. According to another expert on the PG film, Bill Munns, who did some work in Hollywood, he has classified this as frame 354. Not a big deal, but still a technical point that it is a different frame than what most people think. It's not 352, it's 354. But yeah, if you were to go to the PG film site today, you'll see many of the artifacts still in place, the tree stumps, the trees, and that's how you know that this is the place. Because at one time the film site got lost and it was rediscovered, but in between that time there were a lot of pretenders saying that, oh no, the film site here, and a fellow by the name in Mississippi, I won't mention his name, was saying, oh no, the film site over here. And so it got lost, and some people from the Bluff Creek project rediscovered the film site. And when I said it got lost, it basically the trees and all the new shoots that were growing up in the area just pretty much buried the film site where it's non-recognizable with all the tree limbs. And they got in there and they said, well, this could possibly be this tree, et cetera, and they were able to determine that this is the film site. So this stump is from the film site, but as you can see, all the trees here were not there at the time. You see, the only thing they agree upon on the famous footage is the big tree. The skeptics and the doubters all say, that's the big tree, that is the big tree. So this is some of the early frames from the movie film. When Roger got his camera out, the Kodak K100 16mm camera, these are some of the first frame number 4 or frame number 3. This is Bluff Creek, this is the bank, this is the subject, and by a few frames later, this is the same area. The subject is still here, it almost disappears, but because he's moving forward towards the subject trying to get a picture, the camera is shaking. And so that's why you have some camera blur right there. So this is shaking. As he tries to get closer, things go a little bit blurry. This is October 20th, 2017. And if you look at the base of the tree, do you see someone? That's me. That's at about 1:30 p.m. So I was there on the film site 50 years to the day. And a lot of people were there, but it was such a big moment for me as an investigator and a researcher. I said, I just absolutely have to have a photo at that exact time when the film was shot 50 years after the fact. 50 years later, I don't know if I will be here. So that's me. That is the big tree. And that's October 20th, 2017. The very next day, or actually that same day, it rained. By October 21st, it was snowing up in that area. The first time I've been in that area where it has snowed. So some of you older folks or more mature people might have had a camera like this at one point in your life. This is the type of camera that Roger used. It was a rental camera, and he failed to pay the rent on it, and so he got arrested for it, and he was released on his own recognizance to repay the rental fee for the camera. So for the skeptics and the doubters, that's a red flag. But it's just, like I stated before, he was this chronic inventor, chronic going from one thing to the next thing, trying to support his family, his wife and his 3 children. And so he did not pay the rental fee on the camera. It's not a big deal, but if you were a skeptic or a doubter, you could make it into a big deal. But this is the type of camera that was used, and some of you older folks may have had a camera like this at one point in your life. Film camera. This is the internal of the camera, and so this is, you see it here, you have to put something over you to load the film, and this is how they did it back in the day. They don't do that anymore. But if you look at the PG film compared to what we have now in terms of quote-unquote Bigfoot footage today, nothing compares to the PG film. There are many frames that are very sharp that most people fail to acknowledge or realize, but if you could see what Ken had demonstrated in his presentation, where you see the subject very close up from the Cibachrome prints, that there are some very good frames in the film, contrary to what people have stated. So this here, what do you think that is? This is a man in a costume. And so you can see very quickly how things start to fall apart. And this is actually a very sharp image of a man in a costume. And when you see the film, the PG film, as a film, you see all the muscles moving in the subject, or you see things moving in the subject that you just do not grab or is not evident with an individual in a costume. And so I've always stated to people who are not defenders of the film, if the film is a fake, duplicate it, right? Because the argument would be, if the film is a fake, it's obviously a man in a suit. So therefore, for all the doubters and skeptics, lead the charge and show us how it's done. Right? I'm demonstrating to you that here is a man in a costume, and it does not look remotely close to what you see in the PG film. This is the film site. Again, see this piece of... This was shot about 1977 by a fellow in Arizona. Yeah, I believe that was Arizona. That's that stump I showed you. So in 1977, it was still in existence, and you could see the film site at the time was more recognizable, and you could see some of the stumps. So they were actually on the PG film site prior to the film being shot. They were actually logging in this specific area. And they were probably turning around the big trucks to load the logs because that area was so flat and open. So here is, this is about probably 1977 again. This is the legendary René de Hinden, and you could probably just go to YouTube to see some of the videos of him. Next to him is Barbara Wasson, who wrote a very excellent book called Sasquatch Apparitions. And if you look over here, can you see my pointer stick there? I'm trying to point. But right here is a tripod, and this is where he's got his camera set up to try to do some recreation. So if you look at this piece right here, this is called the Q-stick tree. It's actually a tree that's dead, and there it is right there. And in my fold-out postcard, there are images, I think 3 images, that clearly show the cue stick in the frame, which indicates that this is the location. So where am I? Okay, so talking a little bit about the subject walking. And so we're not, again, it's not rocket science, but there does seem to be something very unique and very interesting going on. All I've done in this photo, because as I told you before, I'm an avid person that follows track and field, and I read Runner's World, and I just happened to see in Runner's World that this guy in Africa was out on a jog, and so he's jogging from right to left, but a slow jog. And look at the way his legs are. Look at how his left leg comes up and is almost at a right angle to his upper leg, but he's jogging. And so you look at Patty here on the right-hand side. She, by definition, is walking. Does everyone know what walking is by definition? Walking is, by definition, when you have one foot on the ground all the time. If I were to leave both of my feet, I would be running. And so you know the definition of a mountain too. It's a hill if it's 1,000 feet and below. 1,000 feet and above, it's a mountain. So this is interesting because Patty is walking, as clearly demonstrated on the film, but she's got this characteristic that she could be jogging, but this is how she's naturally walking. So that's another thing that's very interesting about the film. Why is she lifting her lower leg in this unusual fashion? So if I came in with, say, I wanted to fake something, I probably would not incorporate that into my fakery. It would probably be the last thing I would do. And I certainly would not do it in broad daylight, because broad daylight would tend to give things away rather than conceal them. So the gentleman, I'm going into a little bit of history. The gentleman on the right here is the late George Haas. And so he was up at the film site in June of 1968 with John Green, that was his first time there. And George was taking photographs, slides in fact. And so see these 3 rocks? So what George, it's hard to believe, but from October of 67 to June of 68, the tracks were still on the ground there. The tracks were still observable. And the lady here is looking at me a little awkward, because it's hard to believe that that trackway would still be evident that many months later, which is what, 9 months? But they were there. John Green testified to that, and George Haas saw it too. They weren't the best tracks, but you could clearly see where the subject had walked, that the indentations. And so what George did, again, as a souvenir, where Patty had walked, he pulled these rocks out. Patty stepped on these rocks, these 3 rocks. And he did it not for any scientific reason. He did it because he wanted to take home a souvenir. George has passed on. When he passed on, all his files went to a fellow by the name of Warren Thompson. So when Warren Thompson passed on, all of that information came to me, so I am now in possession of those rocks. Those rocks Patty stepped on. This is the film site here with a lot of information from the famous 352 frame to the film site, and you could see how big it is. It's a very big film site, and it's hard to see from far away, but right there is Rene Dahinden's son, right there. And he's right walking in the path that Patty walked in, right there. And you could see how open and big that film site is. And right here is Bluff Creek. But back then in the 70s, the early 60s, it was wide open. Since that time, when we were there last year, it's overgrown tremendously, but it's still recognizable as the place. Right around 1982, does anyone know who Eric Betchford is? He was kind of like the bad boy of Bigfooting, but he got a hold of a Kodak K100 camera, some Kodak film, and a guy in a costume, and he went to the film site, and he tried to replicate the film. This is what you see right there. That's his attempt to recreate the film, and that's one frame. I've never seen that film, but Warren Thompson did, and Warren Thompson told me, compared to the PG film, it's like night and day. Completely different. And you could see right here with your own eyes that this does not look like the subject in the film. So if you're trying to fake something, this attempt here by Eric Beckshort, who's now deceased, failed miserably. This is another aspect. We were there in 2018, 2017, October. This stump is called Smiley Face right here. The subject is going behind it. The reason why it's called Smiley Face, because it looks like there's two eyes and maybe it's smiling right here with its mouth. So hence the nickname Smiley Face for that stump. And so what one of the investigators who wrote a book about it, Robert Leiterman, had pointed out to me, he said, look, Dan, I think this artifact here that's seen in the original movie, he's pointing to it right here, is still in existence in 2017, 2018, but covered with moss. Because if you look really closely, what we did to get the sight line, there is, see that? It's hard to say. This is, we had a guy in a green suit, which was the wrong color. We had a guy in a green suit, a green shirt, stand right here. We should have had a red suit to say we wanted him to get in the sight line where the film was being shot. So we got the right measurement exactly as to what was right of it, what was left of it. And so this artifact that is seen in the original movie is likely right here. So many of the things that are seen in the original movie can still be seen today if you were to go to the film site. And so this is some of the work that we have continued to do as part of the Bluff Creek project. So that is the backside of Robert Leiterman's head. He's a retired ranger from the state of California. And I took this photo, and he's just pointing out that detail in the film, and you could see how the forest has grown up in that area, so it's not clear everything going this way. A lot of trees have grown up. So in February of 1968, the late Ivan T. Sanderson wrote perhaps the most popular article on the PG film for the now defunct Argosy magazine. So if you were, he published on the cover the first frames of the film, and it was the first time that the public had an opportunity to see some of the frames from the film. So that was a very rare magazine, so if you were to go on any of the auction sites, eBay or whatnot, you're probably not going to find it, and if you are going to find it, expect to pay hundreds of dollars because they're not cheap anymore. They're not cheap. And I have, just so you know, Roger Patterson published a book in 1966 called Do Abominable Snowmen Really Exist? Self-published. It sold for less than $3 in 1966. So I had in my personal library about 4 extra copies. And because I'm getting new books, some of the newer books, I'm selling off some of the older books. So it's in my newsletter. But I took a used copy of his book, put it on eBay, and I said, so everyone will have a chance at this book. I'm selling it. The opening price was $2.95, the original price that it was sold on in 1966, and I just sold it last month. And so the ending price was $405 for that book. So if people say that there's no money in Bigfoot books, I beg to disagree with you. That you hold on to some of these books and they could be very, very valuable. So that's why I'm saying if Ken's got books out there that are self-published, I would say grab them. 20 years from now, they're going to be worth a lot more. So there is Roger Patterson's super rare and now super expensive book. There it is right there. How many people have a copy of that book? One person. It's a very hard book to get a hold of, but you're not going to get it for cheap. Had Roger Patterson never got that famous movie, the book would probably just sell for maybe $10 or so at today's market. This is me in summer of 2012 on the PG film site, and I was helping them pulling measurements. This is a measuring tape, and this is my notebook as to what I was scribbling down as to where the trees were to re-verify that to verify that this is in fact the film site, to demonstrate. That's me with my dog. Again, this is my dog here. He's since passed away, a Shepherd Lab. But I have with me my measuring tape and a roll-out tape measure. And you can see my pants are wet here. And so Bluff Creek is there. And so the easiest way to get across the creek is just to go through it with an old pair of sneakers. You are going to get wet if you're in that area. And October is a perfect time to go because the mosquitoes have kind of gone away. In the summertime, they could be a real problem. This is the guy from Finding Bigfoot, Bobo, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with him. But this is us in summer 2012, and I was experimenting, and I took some film footage of him with the Kodak K100 camera, and he is exactly 50 feet away from my camera. And so, again, even though Bobo is, I think, 6 feet 2 inches tall, maybe 6 foot 3 inches tall, about as tall as Greg here, a tall guy. But again, it just, once you get farther away from the camera, you don't shrink. It just looks like you're smaller on the film. That's it. It doesn't mean you shrunk. And so I've got the measuring stick next to Bobo at 50 feet, and I was essentially recreating on the film site, trying to use the piece of wood to measure Bobo and just to put him out there in the field to say, like, is this a valid experiment? Can it work? And as I demonstrated to you with Greg standing here, he's 6 feet 2, 6 feet 1, with a 2 foot piece of wood in the same film plane, that it is valid to measure him. There's the piece of wood we used for the experiment. Looks like I'm going over time, so we'll hurry up a little bit. This was the group that was with us in July of 2012. Bill Munns is here. Cliff Barackman is here. This is some more experimentation. More experimentation with the man with a 2 foot piece of wood there. And again, more experimentation off the film site. Same. This is Bluff Creek. This is right there at the film site, and this is some soil erosion from the heavy rains. As you could see, this area here right near the film site has just basically collapsed into Bluff Creek. And so things are constantly changing. This is at 1:30, October 20th, and the sun is straight up, right above the film site. So when you're filming, you're going to get a shadow just like you do see in the PG film site. And so when Roger stated what time the film was shot, that made sense. If he said it was 6 o'clock or whatever, that wouldn't have made sense. But so I took photos of where the sun was at that time of day, and the sun is straight up at 1:30 in the afternoon when the film was shot, which would create the shadows that you see in the film. When I talked about Lyle Laverty going to the film site, it was October 23rd, 3 days after the fact. This is his best shot. And so that's Patty's track, 14.5 inches long. and he told me it sunk into the ground about 3/4 of an inch deep, and he said he was 170 pounds and his boot tracks were barely making a dent in the soil. So whatever was walking there was much heavier than him, as you could see from this photo. This is a casting of that photo that Bob Titmus made after the fact. And if you've read Dr. Jeff Meldrum's book, this area right here is what he's talking about, that mid-tarsal break. So you would think if it's just an artificial foot, it would just be flat. But here you see it. There's a lot of dynamic signatures that you see. And this is the mid-tarsal break. This is an original casting. And if you look closely here, it's been glued back together because this casting did break. And so it's never been washed. So what you see is some of the soil from the PG film site. But that's what you get when you have a real Bigfoot. That is not a fake casting. And there it is, viewed straight up. So when I was at the Willow Creek Museum many years ago, they allowed me to photograph the original casting. There it is, and you could see where it's broke in the center in the mid-tarsal break because it's so thin in that area. But those are the tracks that are left behind. So Jeff Meldrum made this composite of all the tracks that were collected by Bob Titmus, who's now deceased. But you could see that more than likely a living foot had made those tracks, because if it were just a fake foot, like a wooden appliance or something, they would all pretty much be the same. But here you could see the dynamic signature of a moving foot. This is Jeff Meldrum's compilation of the Plaster castings. This is John Green when he was there in June of '68, and this is his son, and they were trying to do a recreation footage of the film. This is John Green right here. Can you see my arrow? That's John Green. This is Jim McLaren. Jim McLaren is still living in Ecuador or somewhere out there. But they, if you look at what they're looking at, this is June of '68. The film was shot in October of '67. They are looking at the remnants of the footprints. Notice how they're both looking down? So this is where the trackway was, and they're getting lined up to do their recreation film. And this image was shot by the late George Haas. That's Jim McLaren, and in Willow Creek, if you ever go to Willow Creek, California, this is the redwood statue that he made of Bigfoot. This is the film site, and let's see. This is about 2012. This is a short video. I think my dog is in it, but you could see how it is the film site, but there's a lot of overgrowth. A lot of trees have since grown up in that area. And on this occasion, I was here by myself. And I did see a big bear, and so I grabbed my dog because I didn't want him going after it because it would be no contest. So that is the film site, but it's grown up tremendously, and we're trying to trim it back a little bit so we could get the same view that Roger had at the time. So in terms of, there has always been a question, what lens did Roger have? And I'll go through this briefly. There's a 15 millimeter lens to this side and a 25 millimeter lens on this side, and with different lenses you get different perspectives. Some is wide angle, and we're still working on that idea as to what lens Roger Patterson had on the film. He did state, he actually never stated that, I take that back. One of the investigators, Renee DeHinden, found out that it was a 25 millimeter lens that shot the film with that camera because they were interchangeable. You could take the lens off and put a 15 millimeter, take it off, put a 20 millimeter lens. And so when you take the different lenses, you get different viewpoints. Some is wide angle, some is close. And so this is part of that experiment, trying to determine which lens was there. So Roger Patterson himself never said what lens he had, and no one ever bothered to really catalog the camera and what lens. Only we know that he returned it. And according to Renee DeHinden, that camera went back to Yakima to Shepard's Camera Shop, and they in turn, because it was of no value to them, sold it to Del Monte Fruit Company, and that's the last we've seen or heard of it. So in terms of evidence, a lot of this stuff is just kind of, it just goes away. So again, this is 18 millimeter lens on top, 34 in the center, 55 millimeter lens, and you could see that water bottle, the different perspectives you get with different lenses. So that's the reason why I'm telling you about the lenses. It's very important to know which lens is on the camera to determine the size of the subject. This is the type of film that was in the camera, the Kodak film. This is Al Hodgson, who took possession. He's Al Diatley, who took possession of the film. He's Roger Patterson's brother-in-law, who took possession of the film in Yakima to have it processed when Roger flew it to him to have it processed. And he's kind of vague as to where it was developed, possibly in Seattle. So this is telling. This was done with considerable expense with the NASA project that Peter Byrne financed, I think to the tune of about $70,000. This is a composite of the subject walking on the film site, and you see 4 different views of the subject. Right next to the subject in the same film plane, in the same film path, is Al Hodgson's son from Willow Creek, and he's 6 feet tall. And you could see he's standing looking at you like I am right now. And he's 6 feet tall, and his width across isn't even as big as Patty is sideways. So he's right there. If this subject were to walk further, it'd be walking right into him. So it gives you a scale how big the subject was in comparison to Mike Hodgson. And this black and white photo was shot by Peter Byrne. And so when they did this study at considerable cost, they were able to match exactly where the trees were and place that photo into the Patty image to get the look and feel. And you could see a man of 6 feet tall is a little bit smaller all the way around compared to the film subject. So very doubtful if you're looking at a man in a costume.